in an essay titled Winter Mind, Philip Simmons writes of silence. I have on my office door, he says, these words from an accomplished Indian yogi. Before speaking, consider whether it is an improvement upon silence. The man who wrote them once went 19 years without speaking, Simmons said, setting a standard I can't hope to meet. Yet his words remind me that when we do speak, we must speak truth. Even more important, he said, because truth is so often eludes us, we must speak in kindness. In fact, he said, we might amend the yogi's saying to read, before speaking, consider whether you speak out of love. If we could speak out of love, Simmons said, we could change everything. And maybe I could end this essay right here. Philip's words remind me of the poignant irony that I'm about to stand before you here for 20 minutes and talk on the subject of holding your tongue. But can you imagine if we actually practiced Simmons' proclamation? If we paused to meditate on love before we spoke. I want to share a few more paragraphs from Philip Simmons' essay because I believe it paints such a beautiful image of the role of silence in our lives. The word infant, says Philip, means without speech. And as infants, we are allowed a few months of wordless union with our mothers. Our first cries express our desire to be returned to our mother's breast. And as soon as we are weaned from that breast, we start talking. Indeed, we talk our lives away, unaware that no amount of speech will get us back to where we really want to be. The fall into language, Simmons explained, is our expulsion from the garden, our fall into that separateness by which we gain a self, a speaking self, whose words can do little more than mark the absence of all they signify. Only death shuts us up. From silence we come, and unto silence we will return. In the meantime, we talk. In a New Yorker cartoon, Simmons pointed out, a gravestone reads, born 1932, yada, 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 died 1995. But we don't have to die to experience silence. We all have memories of important silences in our lives. I recall from my youth, says Simmons, lying in a hayloft, watching dust dance in a shaft of sunlight. Have you been there? Can you see it? And, he said, I recall in the snack booth at the Old Home Week penny sale, looking down the front of Arlene Colebrook's dress. Both of these events, he explains, occasions of wordless awe. At such moments, we don't choose silence, we fall silent. Silence, like love, isn't something we reason our way into. And once we are in it, we recognize that it has been there all along. Philip continues his story. The forest where we live is mixed hardwoods and conifers, maple, oak, birch, and beech, white pine, spruce, and hemlock. I can hear the sound the forest makes when gently dithered by winter air. Leaves are down, of course, so it's the pines that matter most. They stand tallest and catch the wind. Theirs is a finely sifted sound, a soft hiss through unnumbered needles. Stand by one as it takes the air, and you'll know how God breathes. Hear the sound coming at you over the miles, and you'll hear something like the breath of being itself, the very sigh of our becoming and passing away. This silent sound that Philip writes about is rare, of course. Oh, it's always there, but we must pay a price to hear it. It will cost us something. Some time ago, I read one of those seemingly useless but interesting bits of information that we sometimes come across. I remember reading that there is one part of the human body that never stops moving. Now, at the time I read this riddle, I couldn't guess which body part was being referenced. But I'll bet some of you, under these circumstances, may have figured it out. Any guesses?
Heart.
The heart was my first thought also.
The brain.
But I'm talking about something that we typically think we can control, that's a little more of an external organ.
Tongue.
What's the name of the sermon today?
The tongue?
The tongue.
Wow.
The tongue. And if you're like me, as soon as you can, you're going to the nearest mirror now that you've heard this, and you're going to check it out. And sure enough, when you do, you'll find that that little devil is always wagging in there somewhere. It's always moving. Just you try to hold it still. As I was preparing this sermon, I kept recalling a passage from the Bible, the book of James. It goes like this. The tongue is a little member and boasts great things. Behold how great a matter a little fire kindles. But there's more. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. It defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature. For every kind of beast and bird and serpent and things in the sea has been tamed by humankind. At least we think they have. And that's why they hold councils, isn't it? Who's the trouble? Everything on earth has been tamed. But the tongue can no one tame, says James. It is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless God, and with it we curse people who are made after the similitude of God. I love that term, similitude. Not the image of God, but the similitude. We are a simile for God, a counterpart, a double. As the old song goes, God has no hands but our hands. God has no mouth but our mouth. And yet, says James, out of the same mouth proceed blessings and cursing. This ought not to be. Does a fountain send forth at the same place sweet water and bitter? That's what Brother James said. Now, I talk a lot. I like to talk. I don't know why. Maybe being the fourth child, I had to work real hard to get a word in at the family table. But whatever the reason, I've always consoled myself with the notion that I found the right career as a minister. George Burns once said, "The secret of a good sermon is it has a good beginning and it has a good ending. And the two are as close together as possible." I try to take that under advisement. You know, lots of people are afraid of public speaking. In fact, Jerry Seinfeld once reported that according to most studies, people's number one fear is public speaking. Death is number two. Number two is death. This means to the average person, Jerry says, that if you go to a funeral, you're better off in the casket than doing the eulogy. There's lots of proverbs in the Old Testament part of the Bible about the tongue and speaking. A soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. Or how about this? A wholesome tongue is a tree of life. I don't know what that means, but it sounds great. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Now that's a little different than sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me, isn't it? This one I really like. Whoso keeps his mouth and his tongue keeps his soul from trouble. I have a lot to learn myself in holding my tongue. Here's some other thoughts on silence that I have come across. This is my translation of that King James Version that Carol shared earlier. Better to keep your mouth shut and have people think you are ignorant than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Or how about this? Light travels faster than sound. Maybe that's why some people seem bright until you hear them speak. And I'm reminded, of course, of that old adage that we have 2 ears and but 1 mouth. Therefore, we are designed to listen twice as much as talk. The other side of silence is deep listening. And that means so much more than taking turns to talk while we sit and race our minds to think about what we are going to interject. It means that we must learn to live in silence. When my mind is overactive, when I'm always talking, something shuts down in my spirit. I can see it happen. I can sense it. It's like a valve that lets the water through in one direction only, or an electric current flowing from a battery. I need to pause sometimes and be recharged. I have to let the outside in to open me to new perspectives and new understanding. It's called listening deeply. Karen Armstrong wrote about her work as an historian of religion. Quote, some of the religious practices of the past may sound bizarre to modern ears. Well, think, for example, about whirling dervishes or the Native American Sundance. She said the historian has to learn to empty herself of her own presuppositions and enter the viewpoint of a world that is so very different from her own. I think the same is true of anyone who wants to learn to listen and to truly open up to other people. In other words, a Southern Baptist cannot critically, objectively evaluate Islam as a religion unless they do what Karen Armstrong said. Walk a mile in someone else's moccasins. Our society is so opinionated. We are constantly bombarded by a world that judges, measures, critiques, pigeonholes everything and everybody. We get caught up in it. Do I measure up? We ask ourselves. Do you? Oftentimes, I let this ugly habit seep into my attitude. And that's when I have to stop and breathe and open up and listen. We cannot observe our inner biases as long as we are actively promoting them. I began to notice, Karen Armstrong said, how seldom we make place for the other in social interaction. All too often, people impose their own experience and beliefs on acquaintances and events, making harmful, inaccurate, and dismissive snap judgments, not only about individuals, but about whole cultures. How do we remedy this in our own lives? One of the secrets I have learned is self-deception. Yes, self-deception. That's from A.J. Jacobs. I learned about him on PBS NewsHour in a 3-minute segment called Brief but Spectacular. Jacobs said, if you pretend to be a little bit of a better person, you actually become a better person. It's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting. I didn't make that up, he says, but I love it. A.J. Jacobs is an editor at Esquire magazine and the author of several books, including one called My Life is an Experiment, One Man's Humble Quest to Improve Himself. On the show, he explained his own unique brand of immersive journalism. I've been called the human guinea pig, he said. I'm a writer, and what I like to do is just dive into my topics, totally immerse myself, and change my lifestyle. Well, this is what Armstrong said, isn't it? Enter a viewpoint in a world that is very different from the one that we inhabit. And so he says, I've done dozens of experiments over the years. For example, one he did was called, What Would George Washington Do? George Washington, you see, and I didn't know this, wrote a list as a young man of 110 rules for living. And so he decided that he was going to live these rules. He said, I did another experiment called radical honesty. The idea that whatever's on your brain should come out of your mouth. That was one of the worst months of my life. I feel very lucky, he said, that I'm still married and I still have a job. Because you cannot believe the number of lies that we tell every day. He also did another experiment where he tried to follow all the rules of the Bible for a year. tackle that. I mean, he had to wear no mixed fibers. Oh, there's so many things in there I can tell you about. I did stone adulterers, he said, although I used very small stones, so I didn't hurt anybody. Actually, I think everyone should try experimenting with their lives, said A.J. You don't need to grow a huge beard and live by the laws of the Bible. You can try not gossiping for a week, or try a different toothpaste, or a new way to get to work. Anything to jostle the neurons and create these new pathways and just make your life a little bit more interesting. Now, this brought to mind a story of something that I did a year or two ago. I decided one day that I was in too much of a habit kind of a person, so I started putting my pants on with the different leg first every morning. It only took about a week of this, and now every day of my life that I get dressed and I put on my pants or I put on my shirt, I'm thinking, now is this the way I used to do it, or is this my new habit? I don't want to start another habit. I think they also call that OCD. I don't know. Make your life more interesting. And if we don't do it on our own, sometimes life has a way of doing it for us. In the reading that I opened with this morning, Philip Simmons closes with the lesson life is teaching him on silence. These days, he said, my own relationship with silence grows more intimate. With Lou Gehrig's disease, I face the loss of my ability to speak. Already, my speech slows. My tongue grows unwieldy. Before hefting another syllable across my palate, I consider more seriously whether it will improve upon silence. Philip concluded, because I'm too dense to get the message any other way, and despite my years of meditation, the fates are instructing me quite literally in the art of sitting down and shutting up.